guys, well, I'm driving down the road here and I thought we'd talk about foundry stuff a little bit and my foundry setup and that type of thing. We're on our way headed home here. Normally I don't do any recording on my phone while I'm going down the road, but I thought we'd try this setup. I had to make a trip with my son back over to UW and move his stuff out of the dorm with all this foolishness going on in the world. Why we're having to kind of buckle down a little bit, and we've moved him out. So he and I started out early this morning, and I just threw a microphone in and I thought we'd see how this worked. So I had put out my little video on building a mash plate, and I poured that on Saturday. This is Monday morning here. And Sunday we got some comments from one of the casting groups from a very knowledgeable individual. You know, I have no beef whatsoever, that kind of questioned a little bit my use of a steel crucible. And I responded to that, and I responded on the metal casting list that he's one of the administrators on. But I thought I'd kind of go over my philosophy about casting and your foundry setup and just what I think about all this. Now, he was very much right. You're better off using a clay graphite or a silicon carbide crucible, and I agree with that 100%. You're going to get a better melt. You're usually going to get a safer melt and be able to handle that metal in a little bit safer manner, and you're not going to have iron contamination and that type of thing. Now, the reasons I gave for using a steel crucible, and I had several, and I honestly feel they're legitimate reasons for using it in this instance. Number one is, out of that little speedy melt furnace that I'm melting out of, this is only my 5th or 6th pour out of that. Now, I had said before, I got that furnace 2 or 3, 4, 5 years ago, whatever the case may be, and never had it running. I continued to use my homemade furnace, and it does well, and I've still got it. It's not as efficient as the speedy melt furnace is, but one of my reasons was for using that steel crucible. And when I got that furnace, there is a silicon carbide crucible with it that's in virtually new condition. It may have had a couple of melts in it, but it's a virtually new crucible. It's been fired at least once, but it's in real good shape. So just because I had that crucible, or I'm not casting out of that steel crucible just because I don't have any other options, because I, for the most part, do. Since this is only my 5th or 6th melt out of this new furnace, I wanted a little more, I'm controlling my melts a little bit more, and I wasn't familiar with this furnace at all. I am familiar to some degree, or I was more familiar at that time with the steel crucible, because it's a crucible that I've been using in my other furnace. So I have a little bit better idea of how it melts than a little bit smaller or a little bit less capacity, yet more insulated silicon carbide crucible. So I kind of eliminated one variable by using that crucible. So and it's just so I could learn how the furnace burns and how it melts a little bit better in relation to what I've been casting out of. So that's one of the reasons. Another reason that wasn't a major factor in this particular instance is that out of a steel crucible, in general, for the same size crucible, volume-wise, you're going to get more capacity. You know, you've got a lot more insulation, a lot thicker walls in a clay graphite crucible than you have in a steel crucible. So for larger melts, especially even once I start using a silicon carbide crucible in this furnace, I will always, or a clay graphite crucible, I will always have steel crucibles available, because there's some castings that I do, and I've got a couple of them up now, that will take more capacity than I can get out of a silicon carbide or clay graphite crucible in that furnace. So I can get a little more versatility or melt a little more metal for a larger pour with a steel crucible than I can out of a commercial crucible. Now, the rest of it kind of goes back to my philosophy on foundry work, And when this all kind of came about, I was kind of curious as to when I started melting aluminum primarily. And I went back and looked on my bookshelf, and I normally will date all my books when I get them. And I'm letting the truck get over in front of me so he doesn't run over the top of me. I've got pretty much a complete set of Gingerly books and most of the other foundry books that I can get my hands on or have gotten my hands on over the years. And one of my early Gingerly books, Dave Gingerly books, was dated 1995. And pretty much all of my books from that era were 95 and 96. So I actually started casting probably in 95 or early 96, and I've been casting off and on ever since then. So part of my philosophy for this is one of those things that if somebody's interested enough in it, you can do pretty much anything you want in your home shop. And you've seen that philosophy in a lot of my videos, because if you want to do something, you just do it, because people say you can't, or because you don't have the fancy equipment to do it, or that type of thing. That shouldn't be a deterrent from anybody doing anything, and that's true with foundry work. When I first started casting, I didn't have a commercial crucible, I didn't have a pouring shank, didn't have tongs, didn't have any of that. What I did have, and one of the things that was advocated through the Gingerly series of books, was that you can start casting metal and building machine tools and tooling and things like that for a minimal cost. And a lot of that was done, or started out being done, with a steel crucible. And in its essence, when everybody started out doing that, what we're doing is playing with fire and metal. We're using fire to melt metal. We're not really concerned with nitrogen embrittlement. We're not really concerned at that stage of our learning process with iron contamination into our melt, that type of thing. Basically it was put your aluminum into something to melt the aluminum and have a way to pour it. And even now, somebody starting out especially, there are clay graphite and silicon carbide crucibles are readily available. They're relatively inexpensive. Pretty much anybody that's going to do this can come up with the money to do that. Where you run into problems, or where you run into the money pit, is if you are not able or don't have the abilities, the equipment, or the knowledge to do things like form a good set of crucible tongs and a good pouring shank. Pouring shank's not a major thing, but if you want a good safe set of crucible tongs, if you have to go and buy those commercially, you're spending a fair amount of money. And that's a deterrent for a lot of people. So while yes, it's better to have commercially made equipment and crucibles and things like that, and tongs and pouring shanks aren't that difficult to do, but if you don't have the equipment, and if you don't have the ability to make a good set of tongs or a good set of or a good pouring shank, I would contend that very often you're probably better off having a simple steel pot with either some nubs welded onto the outside that you can hook with a simple hanger type thing to be able to pour it, very similar to what I've got in that steel crucible I've been using, or if it's notched out with a nub and weld on. Those are relatively simple, and those can either be made in the home shop quite easily, or you can have somebody do it without a major expense for you. So that's part of my reason for that. This stuff, no matter what we think, is not rocket science, at least at the beginner's level. So, like I say, we don't care about most of this stuff. I just said we just moved my son out, or he and I just moved him out of the dorms this morning. He's there for physics and aerospace engineering. That's rocket science. This melting metal stuff and dumping it into a sand mold is not rocket science. We can all do that. You want to be safe about that. I don't want anybody to think that I'm intentionally doing anything that's unsafe, and if I do, I'm more than happy to fess up to it. One of my comments on the Metal Casters group was, if you watched my video, one of the things that I've done is I've made a stand for the little tray that I use for my pouring floor. And I've raised those molding flasks up about 11 or 12 inches is about what I think I've raised them up, and I still don't have feet under them and that type of thing. Now, what I did fess up to there, and I can do it right here too, is this is the first time I poured with them in that configuration. With the steel crucible that I'm using and the way that I was pouring it, that was an unsafe pour. When I look at that video, I'm thinking, what were you thinking? That was probably only about a half or a 3/4 pot full of molten aluminum. And weight-wise with everything there was, probably about 50 pounds of material between crucible and the molten aluminum. For me to raise it up at the beginning of the pour when that crucible was relatively full, to raise it up as high as I had to do it and then tilt that crucible to get it to pour, I was way too close. Now, with even that pot with a pouring shank off the side of it, or a commercial crucible in a pouring shank where I'm holding it over on the side and pouring it, that's not an issue at all. But to get that much aluminum up with that style pot and mechanism to fill the molds, I was way too close to that crucible and that big pot of hot metal. So something to think about. You always want to be safe, and I don't promote anybody to do anything unsafe in anything we do in the shop, whether it's foundry work, machine work, woodwork, if I'm working on my airplane, any of that stuff. You want to be as safe as you can be, and you have to be the judge of what your risk factor is. Normally when I'm pouring, you're going to see me wearing safety glasses. I very rarely will get out a face shield. I do have my heavy gloves. I normally will pour, usually with leather boots. I have been recently pouring with a pair of nylon and leather hiking boots, which isn't the safest thing in the world. So you want to assess your own risk factors and decide what you're comfortable doing. And this, I guess, is my little disclaimer. Anything I do is not a recommendation for you to do it. You have to be informed enough and knowledgeable enough about what you're doing to decide if it's safe for you. I'm pretty comfortable with the way I do things right now. When I do go to pour a couple of the patterns that I've already got made up in the larger flasks, I will pour them out of either that or another steel crucible, and you'll see them poured at ground level. I'll still have something underneath and around that flask to contain anything that might spill. But pouring that extra metal, and there again, I want that extra capacity, that's going to be poured on the floor rather than up on that little stand that I built. So just something to be aware of to decide what the best way to pour your metal is. Another factor that was brought up was burnouts or leaks on a steel crucible. Now, knock on wood, I've used steel crucibles off and on since '96, and along the way I have used both clay graphite and silicon carbide crucibles. And you'll see me use more crucibles as time goes on too, especially for some specialty alloys that I've got in the works to pour for different projects. You're going to see some different size crucibles as time goes on, and you're going to see some specialty virgin alloys for some special applications of stuff that I've got in the works and have done in the past. So I'm familiar with all of the methods of handling the metal, all three, and usually advantages and disadvantages of all of them. You're still going to see those steel crucibles on these bigger molds because I don't have a furnace big enough to handle the capacity of metal that I need to melt and be able to pour. So just something to be aware of. But there's steel crucibles can leak, can blow out, get burned through. Knock on wood, in the times that I've been casting, I've never had one burn out on me. Whether I've been fortunate or whether I'm just careful enough to inspect my crucibles. My crucibles are made out of, when I'm making a steel crucible, it's fairly substantial steel that I'm welding those up out of. So it's usually a heavy weld casing, and like I say, we inspect those with between melts, and I pretty much know what's going on with those. So anyway, that's my two cents worth as I sail on down the road here. We're getting closer to home. We've got another 40 or 50 miles to go. But hopefully that kind of explains my position on it. This is something that anybody can do. Like I say, not rocket science. So we're going along, we're doing our thing. You want to do it in as safe a manner as you can, but there are also no hard and fast rules of you have to do something this way. There's some stuff once you get to advanced casting stuff that is kind of important. And if you're doing commercial stuff for industry and it's specialty applications, then yes, you have to be aware of all of those things for it. But the majority of things that are done in the home shop for our own use or for limited production on non-structural stuff, we don't necessarily need to know everything there is about everything. So anyway, hopefully that clears up my position on it a little bit and explains things a little bit better for you. I hope everybody's staying safe, and I appreciate you guys taking the time to watch all these that I put out. And comments or suggestions, leave them in the comments section for me below. And as always, I'll finish it off. Thanks for taking the time to watch, guys.